Today we're going to look at the life of one of the most important of the Byzantine emperors, Maurice, who ruled from 582 to 602. One of the primary things that makes Maurice important is that he is more or less the archetype for all of the emperors who come after him, in that he is not only the emperor, but also the chief general of the empire. To recapitulate what I said about Maurice during my video on Tiberius II, and then to add to it, I'd like to talk about how he came to be emperor. So, under Tiberius II, Maurice was his primary general on the Eastern Front. For about 8 or so years, he was the main field commander of Byzantium's largest army facing the Persians, and he was largely successful. I don't think he lost very many battles during that time. So when Tiberius II was getting older and more sickly, he named Maurice as his Caesar, and he did not live long beyond that point. So in 582, Maurice is proclaimed Augustus, and one of his first moves is to marry Tiberius' daughter. That gives him a greater claim to legitimacy. There were still many members of the Justinian family around, and at this point it would be a good idea to be as legitimate as possible, and marrying Tiberius' daughter was one way to do that. Probably the oddest thing about Maurice's reign is that whereas most of his predecessors really struggled when they had to deal with foreign policy challenges, Maurice was more or less the exact opposite. He excelled at dealing with foreign problems, but he really struggled when it came to managing his domestic affairs. Now, part of this was not his fault. After the Nika riots, Justinian had greatly rolled back the privileges of the Blues and the Greens, and the whole massacre under Belisarius had really curbed their appetite for excess. However, this is about 50 years later at this point, and these guys are back to their normal antics, the Blues and the Greens especially being the two most powerful factions, and they're back to faction fighting, murdering rivals, and there's also just urban unrest and crime in general, possibly facilitated by these clubs. It's not really entirely clear. But one weird thing about this is that these problems pervade not only Constantinople, but all Byzantine cities to some degree. So this is basically a time of lots of crime. And there are no organized police forces in the medieval world to deal with some of this stuff. So Maurice never really deals with these problems in any kind of depth, and he spends most of his time in the field commanding armies, so he, more or less avoids the problem as much as he can. However, this general spirit of discontent was spread throughout society. It wasn't just in the cities, and this infected the army as well. Of course, some people in the army would come from the cities, and the attitudes of the cities are normally not, completely divorced from the attitudes of the countryside. So this means that we have a lot of soldiers in the army now who are not really all that eager to follow orders, and they are able and willing to use violence to back up their will to be disobedient. So that will present a major challenge to Maurice, the soldier emperor. Earlier I mentioned that Maurice becomes the archetype for what a Byzantine emperor is. And the main thing that we normally associate with Byzantine emperors from the High Empire is that they led their troops in the battle in person. Maurice is the first person to do that since Theodosius I. It had been 200 years since an emperor had led his men in the battle. And this means that now the age of the palace princes like Arcadius and Honorius and Justinian, that age is over. And from this point forward, the expectation will be that the Byzantine emperor and the princes of the royal family will be leading generals in their own empire. This becomes such a tradition that many Byzantine emperors will now meet their fate on the battlefield. And in fact, the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, will die defending Constantinople in 1453 in the midst of a ferocious battle against the Ottomans. So this will become part and parcel of what it means to be a Byzantine emperor, is the ability to lead your men into battle. Maurice made one other great contribution to Byzantine institutional history when he decided to create the exarchates of Ravenna and Carthage. Now, an exarchate is a government which combines the military and civilian authority under one official, who would be basically the governor, or to use the Byzantine term, exarch. And the reason for him creating this is that he saw that in these constant state of emergencies in these regions, that you needed an official who had full autonomy, or close to full autonomy, and didn't have to seek imperial approval or deal with a colleague who controlled other aspects of the same job. So, on the one hand, this does lessen imperial authority, but it does mean that if you have a good exarch, they can act swiftly and resolve problems more efficiently. So this is a pragmatic measure, but it does create a potential danger in that you can have an exarch who can ingratiate himself with the locals and has control of the military. So if you had a really ambitious exarch, that person could be a rival. He could break away from you or declare himself emperor and have a local following to try to wage a civil war. This problem doesn't emerge too much, but the danger is certainly there. Maurice's creation of the two exarchates in the west are no doubt driven by his appreciation for the severity of the problems in the west. So in Spain, we see that the Visigothic kings are slowly reconquering Spania. Maurice does not respond to that problem, possibly because he saw that the situation was already lost, or possibly because he just didn't care about Spain, or maybe he just didn't have the resources. It's not really clear. He could look at Africa and see that there was a constant attack from the Berbers, and that this was really hampering prosperity. Around this time, Africa, meaning mostly Tunisia to put it in modern terms, was starting to decline economically and agriculturally. So under the Carthaginians and then the Romans, Tunisia had basically been a breadbasket for the ancient world. It had some of the most fertile soil anywhere on Earth. But this is starting to give way to desertification around the time of Maurice. So the prosperity and harvest yields there are going down. This could be caused by any number of factors, maybe from centuries of expecting that land to yield multiple harvests, possibly from climate change and a change in rainfall patterns, especially far inland, away from the Mediterranean. Raiding, there's a lot of things that could play into that. And in Italy, the Lombards are reorganized. So for a while they had fallen into a bit of a civil war. I'll have a whole video on that up later. And they had become disorganized. However, they have a king named Othari who comes to power in 584, and he's able to reunify and get the Lombards back on the right path. And after that, they pose a major threat to the surviving Byzantine territories. And this creates more problems for the Byzantines, and they continue to lose ground. In addition, the popes are not only trying to separate themselves on an ecclesiastical level, as we explored in earlier videos, but they also are trying to create a political independence, and Pope Gregory the Great actually sort of takes a baby step in that direction by making a treaty independent of the Byzantines with the Lombards. Now, ultimately, the Byzantines will acquiesce to this treaty and intervene to make sure that the Lombards keep their part of the bargain, but this is the first step away from the Byzantines and towards an independent papal policy. Later on, they will break away entirely and not really cooperate that much with the Byzantines, but that's still some ways off. So if Maurice was no longer on the Persian front and he wasn't handling the problems out west in person, then what was he doing? We know he's not a palace prince, he's a guy who commands in the field, and where he was fighting for pretty much his entire reign was in the Balkans. And his opponents there are the Avars and Slavs, who we'll get into in more detail next week. For now, suffice to say that these two powers would work together for the most part. The Avars were the senior partner, and they would provide the mounted troops, whereas the Slavs were more or less a subordinate people of the Avars at first, and would serve as infantry. Because Sirmium had fallen right around the time that he was taking power from Tiberius II, some scholars actually think it happened on his watch rather than Tiberius's, but it's not really 100% clear. This means that Maurice is trying to keep the Balkans free of invasion for the entire 20 years or so of his career. So if you're wondering where Maurice was at any given time, he would be somewhere between, I don't know, like modern Bosnia and Constantinople, and maybe he was as far north as modern Romania. So that's where he was pretty much that entire period, moving back and forth on campaign. In 590, there was a complicated palace coup in Persia, and the end result is that the 20-year-old Chosroes II fled to Constantinople to seek the support of Maurice. He claimed that the person who kicked him off the throne that had been held by his father and grandfather was a usurper, and that he required Maurice's assistance. In return, of course, he said that he could do things to help Maurice. Maurice likes the sound of that, so he sends armies, and they put Chosroes back on the throne of Persia. And the two rulers agree to an eternal peace in the year 591. This peace obviously does not prove to be eternal, as is usually the case with peace agreements. Now, Byzantium, under this agreement, will gain large tracts of Armenia. That was a territory that the two powers have been fighting over for many decades by this point. Actually, a couple centuries, going back to Rome and the Parthian Empire, the predecessor for the Sasanian Persian Empire. Basically, Maurice did all this to gain time and resources to concentrate on his ongoing efforts in the Balkans, where he would now double down. And he vastly underestimated Chosroes II and his ambitions. So ultimately, this play would help Maurice for about a decade, but would then come back to bite his successors pretty hard, which is kind of fitting when you think about the fact that Maurice was overthrown by a usurper. Due to his great reputation from his time as commander-in-chief on the Persian front, and due to the influence he held with Chosroes II after he helped restore him to the throne of Persia, Maurice was able to really dictate terms in the east to a great extent, and he was able to arrange frontier affairs how he saw fit. So, on the one hand, if you look at the northern frontier where there were allies of both sides, he was able to gain the upper hand, and his reign marks the high water mark of Byzantine authority in the Caucasus. This is a steady improvement from the end of the Lazark War, and now pretty much all of the tribes in that region would be much more inclined to fight for Byzantium than for Persia. If we go south and look at Arabia, we see that Maurice's diplomacy enabled him to have dealings with Arabs beyond just the Ghassanid Empire, which had been a client kingdom of the Byzantines for a couple centuries by this point, and he was able to use this increased flexibility and influence as a deterrent against Persian aggression. After all, if you control all of, or at least the majority of, the nomadic groups to the north and the south of the frontiers of the main empire, then the Persians decide to attack Byzantium, then you can get your allies to strike them in the rear and do a lot of damage through raids. So basically, Maurice's arrangements in the east meant that he really had the Persians by the short hairs. They couldn't really attack him without exposing their flanks to massive raiding from the people to their north and south, who they had previously been protected from because they would have their own client kingdoms there to fight against them. You see the Lakhmid kingdom right there. That was a Persian client state. We'll talk more about that when we get to Persia, and then next week when we talk about the Arabs. If you need any further evidence of the extent of Maurice's vision, then this incident should provide it. In 597, Maurice was seriously ill, and it looked like the end was near, so he drew up his plans for succession to the throne. Now, his succession plan was to give the Empire of the East, meaning the Balkans and then the Mesopotamian frontier in Egypt, to his oldest son, Theodosius, and then give his second son, whose name I can't recall, control of the West, meaning the two exarchates and Spain. So basically, if the sources are to be believed, he wanted to revive the Western Empire to some extent. And it also looks like he might have tried to involve his other two sons in the government in some way. However, this plan never went into action because Maurice didn't die in 597. He made a full recovery and got back to doing what he did best, which was commanding armies in the field. Aside from creating the exarchates and for setting a tradition of Byzantine emperors as generals in the field, a tradition which lasted for 900 years, Maurice is also famous for writing a work called the Strategikon, which is a military manual and a source which is very important for ancient and medieval military historians. Now, one of the most famous recommendations that Maurice makes is that unreliable mercenaries should be replaced with local peasant militias. He believes that these troops are less likely to mutiny and that they are generally more reliable. Not only that, they'd also be cheaper. This will be a description that will take on special significance when we find out how Maurice dies. He also provides lots of interesting ethnographic information. So we learn a lot about the Lombards, the Slavs, the Avars, and other groups from Maurice. And that's actually where a lot of our information on these groups comes from, since some of these groups had limited or no writing at this time. And another thing that is relevant to Maurice's career is that his recommended tactic for dealing with the Slavs is to attack them during the winter. And we'll see that his last campaign was attempting to do exactly that. Late in the year 602, Maurice ordered his army to winter north of the Danube, and he returned home to Constantinople. He wanted to rejoin his army early in the spring and resume his campaign as quickly as possible in order to follow up on some of the gains that he had made against the Slavs and Avars. He had been crossing the Danube for several years at that point and inflicting damage on them and their home territories, and he thought he was on the verge of winning a major and lasting victory. Again, in his Strategikon, he said that the best time to attack the Slavs is during the winter, so he was just following his own advice. Now, this is something that was highly unusual, this idea of wintering away from the permanent bases that had been established on the frontier. These permanent bases had been the places where Roman and Byzantine armies had been sheltering for winter since the time of Augustus. It was a normal job expectation that you would be able to live in relative comfort over the winter in places that are permanent structures and not tents. And one significant factor is that during this period, the 6th, 7th century, things were colder than they were in previous periods. The classical optimum had ended, so winters could get pretty bitter, especially when you're north of the Danube. So there are a lot of soldiers who are kind of pissed off about this. There's the general discontent of people in general in this time, and then you also have just the fact that soldiers are looking at a long, bitter winter in hostile territory without the protection of their normal camp's walls and the warmth of their normal cots or beds or whatever they were sleeping in. So the soldiers are a powder keg, and eventually there's a minor general in the camp named Phocas who says that he's going to lead the men home and that they're going to sleep in their own beds. So the army follows Phocas and they begin marching back to Constantinople. As Phocas and the mutineers are marching back to the capital, it occurs to them that if they are captured by Maurice, that some of them will be executed and others will be punished severely. So they need to have a cause they can hold up as their reason for this mutiny to make themselves the righteous party and the party that was aggrieved. So they announced their intention to depose Maurice, saying he was a bad emperor, and they said that they were going to put his eldest son, Theodosius, in power. Theodosius was probably an adult by this point and may have had some experience of his own, so this didn't seem like a completely unreasonable thing. And it also didn't look like they were trying to intervene too much in dynastic politics, merely standing up for their own interest, something that had been done in the past and was not super controversial. I mean, granted, it's always controversial, but this wasn't something that was completely out of keeping with army traditions. Now, the thing that really complicated this mutiny is that at the same time, there was a major riot in Constantinople. The Blues and the Greens had put aside their own usual bickering and their constant back and forth murders of each other's membership, and they were united to riot because Maurice had passed a lot of regulations against their activities, and they weren't having it. They wanted autonomy. They wanted to self-regulate, and Maurice disagreed with their views. Now, surprisingly, you would think that most senators, who are pretty much the richest people in the city, would be all for law and order and keeping the Blues and the Greens in their place. However, there are a lot of ambitious senators who, for whatever reason, really did not like Maurice. So they actually supported the riots and sided with the Blues and the Greens. So before Phocas can even get to the city, the rioters actually storm the palace, and they capture Maurice and his 4 sons and kill all of them, and they also execute Maurice's wife, if I'm not mistaken. So when Phocas arrives, there is no emperor because he's dead, there are no obvious heirs, and at this point Phocas has the most troops under his command, so he's proclaimed the emperor. The rioters think that they are his allies, and the Senate approves of this action. This is a picture of an artist rendition of what this might have looked like. You see the heads on the spikes. The longest spike is for Maurice himself. So, interestingly enough, the first soldier emperor of the Byzantines was executed by his own men, effectively, for his policies. Yeah, sort of a sad way to go out, especially looking at how great his legacy actually was. So let's assess the contributions of Maurice to the Byzantine Empire. So, first and foremost, he was a good general. That was sort of his background. That's why he was in the office in the first place. And he's also an important historical source that has to count in his favor. He's a pretty pragmatic problem solver. His creation of the Exarchate system shows that. He didn't necessarily see through all the potential consequences, but he did create a fairly lasting arrangement. The Exarchate of Ravenna would survive beyond the fall of Ravenna, in the sense that there were Byzantine territories which remained in Italy for a very long time. The last of them were not eliminated until the 11th century. And he had a pretty solid vision overall for foreign policy. His Eastern arrangement was pretty smart, and it looked like he was on the cusp of achieving something lasting in the Balkans. So, had he taken care of business in other areas as effectively, or reasonably effectively, he would have gone down as one of the great Byzantine emperors. However, he paid insufficient detail to popular military and elite discontent in his empire, and that ultimately cost him his throne and his life. One job of an emperor is to be reasonably popular. Your palace guard is pretty effective. However, in the age before machine guns and tear gas and electrified fences and other modern technology which makes a small number of well-equipped people able to hold off a horde, there's only so much that a well-armored, well-trained guy with an axe or a sword can do if he's faced with an entire mob. You have to have room around you to wield your weapons, so a well-armed bodyguard can be overwhelmed by sheer numbers. And if you don't have the population on your side and you live in a confined area like a city, then you need to have the population on your side to some extent to prevent them from overthrowing you. Because physically speaking, they are perfectly capable of doing that, provided that they are sufficiently angry. You also need the military to be on your side, especially if you're going to command them in the field. There are plenty of occasions in earlier Roman history and a couple in Byzantine history where discontent soldiers will assassinate an emperor, or even just a general, for some slight or because they feel the general is unnecessarily endangering them. Had Maurice been present with his army north of the Danube, it's possible that the mutiny there might have resulted in his death away from home. And also, it's sort of interesting that he didn't have the support of the elite either. The thing about having elite support is that their support is always fickle because they have their own ambitions, and it can be hard to gauge where you stand with them. So if you really want their support, you don't actively alienate them, and you make sure that you have reasonable support among the population and the military so that the elite have nowhere to go to find a backing for their personal ambitions. And while his Persian intervention in the short term and the medium term was a pretty brilliant move, and it would have succeeded really well had he been able to continue his career and then pass his empire on peacefully to his sons, it fell apart because of the usurpation of Bokhass. Now, not surprisingly, the Persian king Chosroes II was able to claim a special sense of kinship with Maurice, since Maurice had helped restore him to his throne, and he intervened in Roman affairs, or Byzantine affairs, claiming that, hey, I am trying to set things right by dealing with this usurper Bokhass and, bringing justice back to the Roman Empire. And that led to the most devastating war in Byzantine history, the Byzantine-Sasanian War of 602 to 628, something that we'll discuss next week.